Horizon Chance, G reaction. This is England South Sea Bubble. It was Walpole. Extra part 5 with 10 extra credits. Yeah, so far we've seen how South Sea Bubble, basically greed led people to be more stupid, I guess. They didn't see how this one day might blow up. It blew up in the last part. I guess in this we'll see the aftermath of that. So yeah, let's watch it.
Last time, we left off with Robert Walpole seeing an incredible opportunity in the collapse of the South Sea Company, and trying to maintain the very delicate balance between being the incorruptible hero of the people who opposed all this market madness, and pulling the strings behind the scenes just right so that the only horrible corruption that actually got exposed was that of the people who stood between him and being Prime Minister. Unfortunately for him, there was about to be a wrench thrown in the works. You see, Robert Knight was the cashier of the South Sea Company, and he had secretly been keeping a record of all of the company's transactions, including a list of everybody they'd bribed. If this list fell into the hands of anybody with honest intent, it would bring down most of the political establishment of Britain and ruin Walpole's chance at power. Now, you'd think at this point the government would just raid the South Sea offices, confiscate everything, including this ledger, and take all of the principal actors into custody. But instead, they began to debate how to form a committee to investigate South Sea, which is probably partly due to a lot of prodding from—
Come on, man. Around this time, there was no secret services like that would do that, right? I mean, in the end, it's up to the people in power, which was in it already. People in the parliament, which was part of South Sea Company. They invested in that. So yeah, of course they're going to do that.
Walpole. This gave Robert Knight time to cook the books, adding legions of phony names to hide just how badly they'd overstepped the government's strictures on what could be lent to whom. But perhaps more importantly, it gave him time to move the ledger, with its list of who they'd bribed still intact, from the company's files into his own personal possession. Finally, though, the government got their act together and called Knight in front of the committee to investigate just what exactly went on at South Sea. This left him with, as one of my favorite commentators on the period put it, 3 options. Tell them nothing, which would leave him in prison for a very long time. Tell them everything, which would certainly bring down the government and probably put him on a lot of people's short lists for a very untimely, very bloody accident. Or, as soon as the day's questioning was over, walk out the door, grab the first coach for Dover, and hop a ship across the channel. Needless to say, he chose option 3. Because this was the government and nobody was working on weekends, no one realized he was gone until the following Monday. With such a head start, he wound his way through France and ended up in Brussels, conveniently part of the Austrian Netherlands, one of the few countries in Western Europe without an extradition treaty with Great Britain. But somehow, and by somehow I mean almost certainly with the help of certain members of government, Knight had managed to transfer most of his money overseas well before he absconded with a certain extremely implicating list of names. So he wasn't exactly inconspicuous as he traveled, living the high life and putting himself up in the most expensive hotel in Brussels. The local British charge d'affaires, who wasn't wrapped up in all the machinations from back home, took notice of Knight's extravagance, and per the official instructions of his government and the public statements made by Walpole, went to have Knight arrested. Of course, this was actually the absolute last thing that Walpole, the king, or any of the Whig elite wanted to happen, and at the last moment, somebody tipped Knight off— it was Walpole. Walpole tipped Knight off, and he attempted to flee again. But this—
I mean, is this any of this surprising? I mean, really, is it? All the people, including the king, basically were in this shit. So, of course, Knight had nothing to worry about when he ran, because everybody preferred that he ran, because any other thing, and he's just, yeah, he's fucked up. So, either, have Knight killed off, or make sure the Knight stays in the run. So, of course, he just, ran away with all the money and everything.
This time, he was caught by our industrious charge d'affaires just before he could slip across the border. He was carted off to a prison in Antwerp, and as news reached England, Walpole, the king, and the Whig elite publicly celebrated and demanded his immediate return. Oddly enough, for some reason, Knight's ledger never made it to prison with him. Who knows where that went? It was Walpole. Meanwhile, back in Britain, Blunt came to the realization that, with Knight on the lam, he himself was just about the only person still around who knew just who South Sea had bribed. Unlike Knight, though, Blunt had far fewer compunctions about selling out his former business partners, so he promptly began selling out whomever he could in exchange for a deal. He only squealed to the committee from the House of Commons, though, leaving the House of Lords completely in the dark. He knew which people he was likely to get a better deal from. This threw everything into chaos, and chaos just happened to be something Walpole could make good use of. On top of this, since nobody had that dangerous ledger anymore, Blunt was just working from memory, and in a stroke of great fortune, the names that Blunt could remember just happened to line up remarkably well with the list of people that Walpole needed to get rid of. But there was still the threat of...
Isn't that coincidence, right? I mean, it's just Walpole just has a luck, right? Yeah, Blunt was a genius when it comes to, basically books and numbers, right? So he created all this South Sea bubble. While Walpole is a political genius, he just know how to play things.
Of Robert Knight's far better memory, which was currently sitting in a jail cell in Antwerp. With the public angrily clamoring for his return, and those MPs who weren't involved in the scandal demanding continuously and publicly to be able to question him, the king was forced to bring Knight back. But since Britain had no extradition treaty with the Austrian Netherlands, the king couldn't just haul him back. Instead, he dispatched a man to go convince the Austrian government to send Knight back to England for trial. The particular fellow chosen to do the convincing was a bit of an odd choice, as he had never performed diplomatic service before, and in fact had no obvious qualifications for the job, other than that he was a close friend of Walpole's. Secretly, this fellow had instructions to convince the Austrians that on no condition should they return Knight to Britain. Ever. Please. In fact, if they could just let him escape, that would be awesome. Walpole then also sent 2 letters to the Austrians. One of the letters demanded vociferously that Knight be returned. The other, which is one of the most extraordinary diplomatic documents I have ever read, pretty much explicitly offered the Austrians a blank check as far as the British were concerned, so long as Knight never came back to Britain.
Okay, how fucked up this is, right? I mean, Blunt basically created this environment that is fucked up. Blunt basically made sure that, lots of politicians and the king is in the South Sea Company. So basically wanted that so, the stock goes just up and, there is no hurdle along the way that nobody can fuck with the company. So stocks would rise up. But this in the end also ensure all of this shit. Entire basically politician, parliament and the king basically right now is working against the people of England. I mean, how fucked up that is, right? When people of England realize that, holy shit, all the politician and the king are working against them. The public enemy number 1, Knight, basically everybody wants him back, while the government and the king is making sure that he doesn't. I mean, look at the situation that is created here. If, Blunt didn't do all this shit, if Blunt didn't rope in everybody from the parliament and the king, this situation would have been completely different. They would have hanged Knight, Blunt and everybody. But since he got so many people in power connected to this, all of this shit is happening.
This is the point where history really needs a Benny Hill theme. Parliament wanted Robert Knight back in Britain. Walpole couldn't have him coming back. Parliament offered Knight a royal pardon if he would return to Britain and give his testimony.
Some politician in Parliament wanted, right? Because other politician in Parliament was part of South Sea Company and they don't want Knight coming out here and just, spilling the beans like who they bribed or not. So some politician who want in the bribe wants Walpole back, not the whole Parliament. If anything, majority of Parliament, the Whigs and everybody doesn't want Knight to come back because that would be problematic.
In response, Walpole's agents in Antwerp quietly told Knight that even with such a pardon, Parliament could still prosecute him. Don't you dare. Since the pardoning attempt fell through, sitting members of Parliament hopped on a boat to sail over to the Austrian Netherlands to question Knight personally. But the governor of the Netherlands, tipped off by Walpole, prevented them from entering the country. Then, Walpole convinced the Austrian government to move Knight to a different prison while still pretending he was in the original one, so that any British MPs who happened to show up unannounced couldn't question Knight without their knowing. When rumors started to circulate that Knight wasn't in his original cell in Antwerp, they took him back to Antwerp, put him back in that cell, let someone verify he was there, and then in the middle of the night took him out to the Ardennes forest and just let him go. No one would hear from him again for 20 years. With Knight safely out of the way, Walpole could finally let the hammer of justice come down without consequence for himself. And as that justice hammer was being wielded by a parliamentary committee rather than by the courts, it meant that the guilty were basically trying themselves, and Walpole's now enormous influence could determine exactly where that hammer fell. Whig leaders like John Aislabie, along with notables like the Postmaster General, the First Lord of the Treasury, and the Lord of the Council, either resigned or were stripped of their positions, clearing the way for Walpole to become the First Lord of the Treasury, a position he would use to become what most historians consider the first Prime Minister of England. Many other individuals were fined, but very few served jail time, and even among those fined, very few lost more than they had made from the South Sea bubble. And those who managed to remain in power all knew exactly who they had to thank: Robert Walpole. As for Blunt, well, since he, unlike his associate Knight, was willing to name names, Blunt began trading for a deal on the people he'd bribed as soon as he could. In the end, he was left with £5,000 to his name, which is still probably more than he had at the beginning of this story. And hilariously, he remained a baronet, a title he had been given for his good work with the South Sea Company a few scant months earlier. In fact, his family holds the Blunt baronet to this day. In the end, when we look back on...
Ah, yes, justice is served, right? I mean, yeah. People must think, yeah, at least all this shit happened and lots of people killed themselves because their business went up, because they all went broke. After all this shit, after all the suffering, at least justice was served, right? Fucking Blunt, man. He's like one of those characters in movie. Like, doesn't matter what happens, he always goes out with certain money in his pocket and nothing happens to it, no consequence. Even though he was in the center of all this shit.
All of this madness, I think it's important to remember that Britain couldn't have survived without financial institutions like the South Sea Company and the Bank of England. Without them, the government couldn't have carried the debts it needed to prosecute its wars and keep the country afloat. But without oversight, with politicians financially tied to the entities they were supposed to be responsible for reining in, and with the public good being guarded only by the very people who stood to profit from the public good being subverted, these institutions led the national economy to the brink of ruin, and left generations of the middle class to foot the bill. This is a good lesson. I hope we learn it someday. See you next time.
Alright, there is more after this. So obviously, you know, the way he says South Sea Company was important to save England, but was it though? I mean, look, Bank of England or anybody could have done something like this. I don't know. Maybe it would have been collapsed, but it would have rebounded anyway because it's a whole fucking company, right? I mean, I don't know, something would have happened than this. This is not really saving it. This is saving certain aspect of the country for a little time. But in the end, it's fucking the country in the long run. They were still paying it until 2013. So I don't see it as saving. And also, you know, the entire parliament, politician, and even the king being such stupid morons, they didn't even look at the company and what was happening. They was just fine with the money that was coming in. Now, were they stupid or was that deliberate? Because they knew even things doesn't turn out right, they'll be fine. It's the people that get fucked and they don't care about that. If that is, then they're not stupid, they're assholes, right? Well, I don't know. If you see this as South Sea Company was instrumental in saving England, I don't know, I'm pretty sure there will be other ways to save the country eventually, right? When the shit hits the fan, something would have come up. But no, South Sea Company is the last thing. It's like, you know, like some company, just some major companies in ruin, so they're you know, the only thing they come up with is let's rob a bank and save the company. Like Apple, you know, that's a bad example, but fuck it, you know, Apple's about to get ruined, right? So lots of key people in the Apple decide, let's just fuck it, let's rob a bank and save the company. That's just weird, right? There are other options. South Sea Company is just fucked up. Whatever happened was fucked up. And center of it all was Blunt, and he didn't get any punishment for that. That's just effed up, right? And Walpole was just opportunistic. He just got what he wanted in the end. But after all this, right? I mean, if certain people gain something, there are other peoples at the end of that line who suffers. You can't just gain something other than other people not losing something. I mean, that's how it works, right? That's the law of the universe, I guess. If you want something, then that something has to come from somewhere else. And that's people of England. Walpole got profited, all the politicians got profit, king got profit in the end, but all that profit came from people of England. They just made sure that all the debt and all the profit they took was from the common people. Lots of them killed themselves and was still suffering to this day. This whole thing is fucked up.
Oh, and for any of you who are wondering what happened to Robert Knight after he ran off into the woods, years later he wound up in Paris, used the money he fled with to start a bank, and did quite well for himself. Such is the heavy price of crashing a national economy.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Cities like that tells you like, yeah, man, karma is a real thing, right? Every time you click on the YouTube and there's videos, instant karma, yeah, that's a real thing, right? Karma exists. My ass, it exists. Alright, people, that was it, I guess. That was England South Sea Bubble, the whole series. It was fucking awesome and also fucked up in the process because everybody got away but the common people. Or if you like my Rick's on the phone, like and subscribe, check out the Rick's Handy, there's a link in the description. Check out the cast for place, check out the cards in here. I'll see you next time.